Welcome. Welcome, everyone. I am Jane Kulo. I'm the director of the Virginia Center for the Book, a program of Virginia Humanities, and welcome to the 2022 Virginia Festival of the Book. I'm going to take a moment and pause just to say thank you. This is my first time at a podium at this festival, and I will tell you, I have thought about this moment for more than 2 years, and I expected tears would come. So we'll do our best to get through it with great joy and great appreciation for everyone doing everything they can to follow precautions so we can gather safely. And I, from the bottom of my heart, am so glad to see you all here. Thank you. Now back to official voice. To begin, I'd like to remind you about some general housekeeping. Please silence your cell phones. We've all been in this room when a dinger has gone off. Let's don't do that. If you would like to share about today's program, we invite you to use #VABookFest. We thank the festival's many sponsors and community partners without whom this festival would not be possible. This program is sponsored by the Carol Troxell Fund. As many of you know, the festival is free to attend, but not free of cost. We invite you to support your festival with a donation at vabook.org/give so that we may sustain it for many more years. Finally, please do support our amazing authors and our local booksellers by purchasing a book. Our author will be available for book signing after the program. And of course, our bookseller today is Dominion Bookshop. And now, let's get to why we're here for our 2022 Carol Troxell Reader, Imani Perry. Many in the room know the origin of this event, but it is important to reiterate. Carol Troxell, a voracious reader and supporter of authors, owned and operated Dominion Bookshop for 30 years. After she passed away in 2017, the Carol Troxell Fund was developed to honor Carol and her longtime community engagement, devoted service to her customers, and advocacy for a large family of authors. Carol created so much more than a bookshop. She supported a community devoted to books, reading, thought, and inquiry. This annual festival event presents excellent writing from a wide range of genres and topics, illustrating the breadth of Carol's reading interests. Previous Carol Troxell readers include Lisa Coe, reading her debut literary fiction, Jared Krashaska, Reading and Showing, his YA graphic memoir, and Kara Black, sharing her Parisian-based mysteries. Today we are honored to feature Imani Perry. Imani Perry, author of South to America, is the Hughes Rogers Professor of African American Studies at Princeton University, where she also teaches in gender and sexuality studies, law and public affairs, and jazz studies. She is the author of 6 books, including Looking for Lorraine, The Radiant and Radical Life of Lorraine Hansberry, which received the Penn Bograd Weld Award for Biography, the Phi Beta Kappa Christian Gauss Award for Outstanding Work in Literary Scholarship, the Lambda Literary Award for LGBTQ Nonfiction, and the Schultz-Graun Award for Nonfiction from the Publishing Triangle. Dr. Perry's book, May We Forever Stand, A History of the Black National Anthem, was winner of the 2019 American Studies Association John Hope Franklin Book Award for the Best Book in American Studies, the Hurston Wright Award for Nonfiction, and it was a finalist for an NAACP Image Award in Nonfiction. Her book, Breathe, A Letter to My Sons, was a finalist for the 2020 Chautauqua Prize and a finalist for the NAACP Image Award for Excellence in Nonfiction. Dr. Perry is a scholar of law, literary, and cultural studies, and an author of creative nonfiction. She earned her PhD in American Studies from Harvard University, a JD from Harvard Law School, an LLM from Georgetown University Law Center, and a BA from Yale College in Literature and American Studies. A native of Birmingham, Alabama, she lives outside of Philadelphia with her sons. We were honored to welcome Dr. Perry to the 2019 festival to discuss Looking for Lorraine and May We Forever Stand. We would have asked her to talk about her 3rd book that year, but we didn't even know about it in time. So today, she will read from her newest and best-selling book, South to America, A Journey Below the Mason-Dixon to Understand the Soul of a Nation. An essential, surprising journey through the history, rituals, and landscapes of the American South, and a revelatory argument for why you must understand the South in order to understand America. Please, I present to you Dr. Imani Perry as the 2022 Carol Troxell Reader.
Thank you so much, Jane, for that beautiful introduction, which most of all reveals how much I like school. So I'm going to do so. I hope it's okay. I'm going to talk rather than read, but I'm going to talk about the book in the context of some happenings over the past couple of weeks, and then I hope we can have something of a discussion. If you've read it or taken a look at it in any way, you know that so much of it begins with encounters, and the book itself is in a sense an invitation to encounter with readers and asking readers to come on a journey with me. And in that process, I have revealed some of my vulnerabilities, some of my biases, in the hope that as a reader, readers will trust me as someone who is imperfect but sincere in my renderings and in my explorations. And I hope that the book functions most of all as a conversation starter. The book is an artifact, but the book also lives in a relationship with people who pick it up. So let me begin by saying I'm so honored to be the Troxell Reader, and I'm delighted to be part of this festival, which I incredibly enjoyed the last time I was here. And it's also wonderful to be in the place, in the town where so many of the people who were influential in my writing of South to America are, including Deborah McDowell, Mark Jefferson, Sean Crawley, and Janet Chow, friends and interlocutors. mentors and people who have taught me. So here we are in the land of founding fathers, the Old Dominion, as it were, and its ways of knowing and doing. One of the stories I tell in South to America is about a teacher I had in high school, Philip McFarland, who's a distinguished writer, who was from Birmingham like me, but who I had always assumed until later in life was from Virginia, because he spoke with such eloquence and erudition of a sort that I associated with Virginia gentry rather than my hometown folks. So, one of the things, and that distinction, or the assumptions and what lies underneath it, is part of what I want to talk about today. I want to think about the conundrums of the South, the complications and the distinctions here. And I'm really, when I say conundrums, I really am quite deliberate in using that word. So often I get asked about the contradictions, and there are many. But conundrums, it has a different connotation, right? They're sort of difficult questions that are hampered, right, about how to be in this world, given who and what we are and where we've come from. So I'll start by talking about Charlotte L. Horton. Charlotte L. Horton was an African-American woman from Philadelphia, near where I currently live. She was in the antebellum period. She was an anti-slavery activist, a poet, an educator, and she went south during the Civil War. And while she was there, she always had a lifelong habit of keeping a diary. And when she went south, she went to St. Helens and went to the historic Penn School, which is still an extraordinary location. And she commented extensively in her diary and in letters to her mother as well on her pupils. And there are three women who I was sort of taken by her descriptions of them, and I just want to give you the brief descriptions of them. First, she says, to begin with the older ones, first there is old Harriet. She is a very kind, pleasant old soul. Comes from Darien, Georgia. Her parents were Africans. She speaks a very foreign tongue. Then she goes on and says of Celia, Celia is one of the best women on the place. She is a cripple. Her feet and limbs were so badly frozen by exposure that her legs were obliged to be amputated just above the knees. But she manages to get about almost as actively as any of the others. And then the third one, she said, there is Wilhelmina, a mulatto. The others are all black. She comes from Virginia and speaks therefore quite intelligibly. She is a good, sensible woman, and both she and her husband, Robert, who is one of my night pupils, are most anxious for their little ones to learn. Now that distinction that she made of the Virginian as more intelligible is of course a sign of some of Horton's biases, as extraordinary a person as she was, but the phrase echoes and perhaps haunts, for me, standing in the Old Dominion, in the land of founding fathers, as it were, in part because though I am a native of Alabama, my proximity to the planter class, as it were, institutionally speaking, goes back over half of my life. Elite universities are thick with their legacy in every region, including New England and the Mid-Atlantic, where I've been most of the time. So when I make the point about the Old Dominion being here, I hope you understand that doesn't mean that it doesn't have satellites elsewhere, but actually sort of thinking about what it means for all of us, right? I say that, I want to say that and also say, and this is sort of anticipatory for our discussion, so I hope that's okay, but one of the most persistent questions that I've gotten as I talked about the book, because I'm saying that really, in some ways, that the rest of the nation uses the South as a repository for the nation's sins, when in fact the entire nation is implicated in the original sins of the displacement and the genocide of indigenous people and the enslavement of African people, is that people say, oh, well, you say that, and then you sort of let the South off the hook. And I don't think that's true, because if it is true, and I think it is, that the South sets the pace for the nation and made the possibility of the nation even, that it leads the way so often, even though it is misconstrued as being behind, then I'm hardly letting the region off the hook by noticing how the rest of the country and sometimes the world follows it. Now Harriet, as she said, speaker of a very foreign tongue, unintelligible old, was multilingual, probably a Gullah speaker, and maybe a speaker of an older language still. More ways of knowing, I would guess, than were actually available to the educated and brilliant Horton. Right? And that kind of observation, for me, is the source of some humility on my part about what I don't know as I went around and discovered, and why there are moments when I am transparent about what I don't understand. Having moved about quite a bit as a child, I grew attentive to differences in language. And having been a mother, had a mother who studied linguistics, I was attentive to layered meanings of language and resistant to hierarchies of language. And having studied critical theory, I noticed language as a tool of power. And as a writer, language is my tool of meaning making, and yet, right, I don't understand everything. Yesterday morning, a local news station in Scottsboro, Alabama, shared the following headline: Scottsboro officer killed, wife critically injured after shooting. Scottsboro officer killed. What had actually happened is that the officer shot his wife and then killed himself. One is put in the mind of Ralph Ellison's famous invocation of a saying of the enslaved: change the jokes, lift the yoke. The manipulations of language have persuasive and sometimes coercive effect. Perhaps there are so many generations of struggling over how to describe the South and its role in the nation, because in our different uses of language, we are battling over meanings and values and who matters. In the 1965 book, The South Today, there's a collection of essays written by Black and white Southerners reflecting on what had changed and what had not by 1965. And it was a predecessor to the book that is most immediately influential to mine, Albert Murray's South to America. And I reread The South Today recently, because I keep going back to these books. It's sort of an uncanny experience for me because I haven't previously written a book that has garnered so much attention where I'm still talking about it like 6 weeks after it was published. And so as a consequence, I'm like, it's sort of a stress, because I'm used to sort of turning my attention to the next thing. And so what I'm doing is, because it's hard to keep thinking about the imperfect thing I created, I'm reading the books that influenced it. So anyway, I reread The South Today recently. And I was and it had me think about this long tradition of return that's part of Southern literature, or writing by Southern exiles, or depending on how you conceive of the region, right, expatriates. And in one chapter, this journalist, Louis Lomax, who's wrote for the Chicago Defender, was the first Black man to work as a television journalist. In one chapter, he tells the story. He flies from New York to Atlanta, and he is recalling the history of his experiences of segregation in Atlanta. And yet he also, Georgia has voted for Goldwater. He sees it as a kind of shadow that's hanging over the city of Atlanta. And yet he's also recognized how the signs of Jim Crow have disappeared he grew up with. And he runs into Martin Luther King Jr. at the airport, and he notices all these people who are coming up to King with admiration, and even people were like, I don't like what you're doing, but I'm proud of you, right? That formulation, which is really interesting. And then he flies on to Valdosta, where he's from. And he makes the following observation when he gets to Valdosta, and this is what is most significant to me about this essay. One can go home again if he remembers and accepts the land of his birth for what it was, if he understands what it has become and why. The homecoming is more complete if one admits that he and his land have shaped each other, that from it springs much of both his weakness and his strength. As I walked down River Street toward the place I was born, only as I walked down River Street towards the place I was born did I realize how much of a child of this land I am. Its mud squished through my toes as I romped on unpaved streets and alleys. Its puritanical somnolescence settled over my childhood dreams. I thought about this also in relationship. I was home in Birmingham for the first time in 2 years, about 2 weeks ago, because of COVID, and the kind of extraordinary feeling of witnessing, faces and a landscape that creates you, that created you, even if you've long departed. And that's part of why I would say when I began to write South to America, there was a defensiveness that animated my initial endeavor, right? So that the mocking I'd heard, the mischaracterization that seemed to settle over the fiction of the South was the chip on my shoulder when I started writing. And yet to return, both physically, but also to return historically, right? To rethink, to and part of the process of writing was a defamiliarization and a refamiliarization. To return was to remember the conundrum of places of extraordinary beauty and warmth and also violence. It was to remember that it was the center of gravity guiding the country on race in the worst ways, even if not always in effect the worst or most racist place. Its organizing principles were hard to live with, even as its people were resilient. Arne Bontam, the writer and intellectual, a black and also a black man in the same book, describes his own movement about the country. First, he described his family's migration from Louisiana to California. And he puzzles a bit about his father and uncle who were diametrically opposed in so many ways. His father was bourgeois and respectable and an upstanding citizen and an integrationist, and his uncle a deep believer in folk ways and a good time and liked to cuss. And that these two men who were so different shared a feeling that if it weren't for the, quote, trouble of the South, they would return home. And he asked, what was it that made the South, excusing what Buddy called the conditions, so appealing for them? And then it was when he went to my ancestral home, the place where my grandparents were from, Huntsville, Alabama, to teach at Oakwood College, that the answer was illuminated for him. And he says, so he describes, the Great Depression has begun, he gets this job at Oakwood, and jobs are hard to come by. And he says that even as difficult as circumstances were in the Depression, quote, it was the best of times and the worst of times to run to that state for refuge. Best because the summer air was so laden with honeysuckle and spirea, it almost drugged the senses at night. That is true of Huntsville. The men and boys rediscovered woods and swamps and streams with which their ancestors had been intimate a century earlier. The living critters still abounded. They were as wild and numerous as anybody had ever dreamed. I made friends with these people and went with them on possum hunts and was astonished to learn how much game they could bring home without gunpowder. Such carryings on amused them while it delighted their palates. It also took their minds off the hard times, and they were ready for church when Sunday came. I followed them there too. The long meter singing was from another world. The shouting was ecstasy itself. At a primitive Baptist foot washing, I saw a woman who rose from her seat and skimmed from the front of the church to the back, her wet feet lightly touching the tops of the pews, her eyes upward. She could have astounded me no more had she walked on water. The members fluttered and wailed, rocked the church with their singing, accepted the miracle for what it was. I like to think that the church he visited was my family's church, Indian Creek Baptist Church, one of a handful of primitive Baptist churches in Huntsville at the time. And maybe my grandmother was there that day. The point is this: there were indeed everyday miracles of living as a protest, to borrow from Lorraine Hand's theory. There were and are in my homeland. And yet Bontam left, pushed out because of his political activism in the wake of the Scottsboro trial. And he went on to Chicago, which he found harrowingly violent and no less segregated than Alabama. And then to Nashville, to work at Fisk, where he ends that essay and where he has found a comfortable place. And that indicates, again, just as Charlotte Horton's words did, that there are Souths, plural. Right? And that's part of the process of discovery. Last night, when I was being driven to the hotel, I was talking to the driver, and again, if you read South to America, you know, I talk to drivers a lot. That's one of my favorite things to do. And especially in the South, because people will talk to you. And that's everywhere. And he asked where I was from, and I told him my story, born in Alabama, and he said, "Oh, he's from Alabama. That's all right. You got out." And it was also, he said, people say you country, we country and stuff, and we down to the we. He said, I said, there's degrees of the South. He said, yes, there's degrees of the South, right? And that's an interesting formulation, and part of the point in the book of describing that, the South's plural, is how much what happens in a place was shaped by the environment and also the desire to harness the land to produce wealth. And it really did shape the configurations, the social and political configurations of each place. But I want to sit with Scottsboro for a minute because Bonton was pushed out, right? And that harrowing case of Black youth falsely accused of raping 2 white women whose lives were ruined, but whose cause became international, was a significant event in the Cold War and exposed the myths of American democracy and its lies indeed. And the women who were called victims in Alabama newspapers back then, like this, the shooting police officer today, were in fact the aggressors. And the men who were called rapists back then were victims. And the world, reading the writings of Bonton, Hughes, and many more, learned the truth by contesting conventional wisdom. Now, when Ralph Ellison was a student in Alabama at Tuskegee University, then Institute, and that's a school that is, I hold in particularly high regard because it is my family school. In fact, when President Foster was president there, he gave my grandmother an award for sending so many children there. It's a now. And anyway, Ellison talked about traveling to Columbus, Georgia, while he was a student at Tuskegee with his band. Have a good time. And it was a dangerous route, right? And he talked in particular about the dangers in Phoenix City, Alabama. Right? And in describing it, he would reference what happened further north in Scottsboro. And the terrorizing behavior, though, particularly of the police in Phoenix City, Alabama. And he wrote of it, the experience, they continued to make life so uncertain that each time we reached Columbus and returned safely to Tuskegee, it was as though we passed through fire and emerged like the mythical phoenix bird, after which presumably the town was named from the flames. And that's in Ellison's essay, An Extravagance of Laughter, and he describes the phenomenon of laughing through the pain in the essay, laughing to keep from crying. It's in the Black Southerners' cultural disposition. And it's a source, and how it's a source of so many stories, and in many ways it's the heart of the storytelling tradition, right? The sort of stories that are sources of humor, but are also stories of terror, right? And he said, thus was violence transcended with cruel but homeopathic laughter, and racial cruelty transformed by a traditional form of folk art. It was a wild, he-man, schoolboy silliness, but the only way we knew for dealing with the inescapable conjunction of laughter and pain. Now, Ellison himself said he was unable to give himself over fully to the act of laughter, even though he understood it was necessary because, quote, because whiteness, quote, was far from secure in its power, it thrived on violence and sought endlessly for its victims. And in its hunger to enforce racial discrimination, it was most indiscriminate as to its victims. It didn't care whether its victims were guilty or innocent, for guilt lay not in individual acts of wrongdoing, but in non-whiteness. Whiteness was a form of manifest destiny which designated Negroes as its territory and challenge. It's a potent description, particularly the language of territory, the relationship between blackness embodied and land, and control of black labor, control of land. To note these rituals of self-preservation that Ellison does, like laughter, beauty and grace and laughter that feels so good, that animates living, to note these rituals has not been, and this is really my point of what I wanted to say today, in this tradition, it doesn't mean the denial of the ugliness, right, of the violence of history. Okay? So to imagine, likewise to imagine in the way that Sun Ra, jazz musician, was born in Birmingham, a short walk from my family home, and educated in Huntsville, Alabama, that when he would say, I'm actually from outer space, right? Didn't mean the opposite of fighting for justice, but it was to assert a sense of self that could expand beyond the terms of domination. To assert, as Bonton did, that segregation was as bad in Chicago as it was in Huntsville, and actually Chicago was much scarier, did nothing to diminish in his assessment the urgency of his testimonies about Alabama and Nashville. So So, part of why this book took on the form of something closer to creative nonfiction than a conventional history, and I've said it this, I'm going to actually use an example. I'm going to pivot from what I've written, because it really, I want to use an example to illustrate it. When I wanted to talk about sugar, and our love for sugar and the stuff, I wanted to not simply talk about, simple carbs and labor and also the palliative effect of sugar. I wanted to explain why. When my grandmother would say, put some more sugar on your cornflakes, baby, that wasn't about a sugar addiction. It was about an assertion that I deserve some sweetness. Right? And that in the context of a place where there's a lot of hard scrabble living and a lot of disregard on the basis of poverty and race and gender, right? That kind of affection, the kind of tenderness is incredibly meaningful, and that's a piece of the culture, right? And in a traditional academic text, there's not much space for that. There's space for the analysis of how much sugar people consume and how much people weigh, and what the industries are. There's not space for why cultures develop certain forms of tenderness in the wake of disaster, or why there's an extravagance of laughter, right? Notwithstanding the devastation of violence, right? And so that's really the point, right? And for me, because I'm a scholar who writes about race a lot, one of the things I've noticed is that in both the academic and the public arena, it appears, at times, what happens is the moment appears to demand a story of absolutes and debasement. And what the literary tradition has afforded me as an alternative is to write from a position of blackness in its fullness, an intimacy across the color line that doesn't deny the violence of white supremacy. Thus, the sin and shame of racism are assumed, but so too is the fact of full humanity. For all of us. Ellison wrote, Negro folklore taught the preservation of one's humanity by masking one's motives and emotions, just as it prepared one to be unsurprised at anything that whites might do, because a concern with race could negate all human bonds, including those of shared blood and experience. And that's true. And so part of also what I'm trying to talk about in the book is the skepticism and ire that I experience as a Black woman in the book, that are an unmasking of the mask, as it were. Right? Arne Bontam described how his father, when he was going off to boarding school, told him not to act colored. And then Bontam's life work became a rejection of that demand. In fact, he said, well, everybody in the society acts colored when they get on the dance floor, so why shouldn't I do it too, authentically, right? And so there's a revelation, an unmasking of the mask is also a kind of authenticity that is offered as an invitation. And sometimes it raises ire, but it is intended truly as an invitation to something more, something new, as it were. I wrote South to America explicitly as a Black daughter of the American South, not as a rarefied experience, but as a vast terrain of experience. The hope has been that the language claims my own frame of reference, our collective framing, slipping the yoke of a narrow perspective that would cast the cornerstone away. Through this body, and I mean that metaphorically, but also in a sense of inheritance, a nation was cultivated. Though standing in the vestibule of the edifices of higher learning for so many generations, to borrow from the great Horton spillers, and also the artifices, vestibule of the artifices of history, hers, mine, ours, Harriet's in this case, is a position of both greatest exposure and illumination. And even though we don't have an answer yet, at least the vision can be a bit clearer. I'll stop there. Thank you. so we have time for questions. Okay, any questions or comments? Thoughts? Yes?
In reading your book, I was struck by the incredible resilience that you talk about, and how that really is leading the country. And I was able to equate that to the resilience that the Southeast faces in terms of climate change. It is absolutely astounding. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that and seeing that. It's really appreciate that. Yes, please.
Yes. My name's Shannon, and we talk about the resilience of the South, and I almost think of the resilience as a fait accompli, meaning we have no choice. We have no choice. So, do you address that in any of your work? Because when I write, I also start with the position of anger and then have to stop and say, okay, well, I want people to read this. And I want to find an audience that will listen. And to do so, I can't do that without accusation or anger as my starting block. Do you see that fait accompli resilience as plain as I do? I mean,
I think so. I love that question. It's really more of a profound observation. So thank you, because the way that I usually approach it is thinking, because I get people say, well, you say, all this terrible stuff happened in the South, and you say that it's the entire nation's responsibility. And I'm like, well, because that's where the money is to be made, right? Like if the money was to be made in Massachusetts, it would have happened there, right? I mean, it's like it's the fact of the intersection of desire for accumulation and what the land would yield, the climate, right? And so I think similarly, right? There is the reality of not, to a certain extent, not having a choice, but there is a choice, right? Because there could be a dramatic social transformation, right? So years ago when I wrote this book that was about sort of how to address racial inequality, and it's called More Beautiful, More Terrible, from a Baldwin quote. And the thing that I kept getting when I would give talks related to that book is, why do you think any of this would work? And I said, well, I'm from Birmingham. Right? If you don't believe in the possibility of social transformation and you're from Birmingham, I don't know, you just took the left and home, right? Literally. I mean, so when I think, which is not to tell a Pollyanna-ish story, because it is still a place of profound inequality, but it is dramatically transformed. And so I think, so there is the thing of not having a choice at the individual level, but I do believe in the possibility, and I believe in the possibility because of the history of organizing of miners, and of the civil rights movement, seeing mutual aid that developed, and also the organizing around climate change. Like, it's not that I'm hopeful, I just don't know. I think the alternative is a moral failing, right? So I'm not naturally hopeful, but one has to hope disciplines, as Miriam Collins says. Hope is discipline, but also hope as a practice shapes your behavior, right? So it's not, you know what I mean? So not in a naive way. But then you ask this question about writing, which is tricky, right? Because I would certainly say I have written many things that raise people's ire in ways that I wish they hadn't. But then I think, well, if I have the luxury, though, if someone has actually allowed me to write something, what good does it do to not be honest, right? And I don't, there's a formula, and I'll say this quite, this is in politics, but there's a formula to writing the kind of things that everybody likes. But that's what you follow if the objective is for everybody to like you. But if the objective is to actually affect some transformation or else resonate with people, like speak to the capacity to reach inside somebody's chest, right, and touch them, and then also, like, just as an aside, like, there's a sentence, and I can't remember what it was, there's a sentence that James Baldwin wrote about hair combing in the Black and it's so negative. And the first time I was so furious, and I threw that book across the room, and I was like, why would he say that, right? And one of my friends who's a writer was like, he's just wrong. He said, well, he's not wrong, it's just you have a different relationship to having your hair combed. And I was like, okay, that may be. But I care so much because I care so much about him as a writer. Like, so there was a relationship there. And it was, for me, that was like one of those moments where I actually learned to appreciate them most because I cared, right? Like I cared about the stuff that I disagreed with because I cared, right? So I just try to be honest, but also to be available for a conversation at the same time, if that makes sense. Such a good question.
Thank you.
Imani, since you don't have your glasses on, I will tell you there's plenty of time
Okay.
still, but if you could repeat the question
Oh, yes,
for everyone, that would be great.
Okay, thank you.
I want to follow up with that a little bit. I'm from Alabama. I practiced law there at one point and was in college with the present governor. And so since you've been there recently, you're a student of there, and I spent a lot of time as a child in Birmingham because my father was from there. How long is it going to take Alabama to get over Governor Ike and Mel Brooks and all the problems they've got and become a hill?
You notice when people talk about like the New South states. Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. Remind me. So the question is, as basically how long is it going to take Alabama to get over its backwardness? The word she uses backwardness. I'm not going to call it that, but yes, the commitment. Tell me if this is fair to say, is sort of this commitment to inequality and exclusion, right? And I wish I knew. I mean, I think that for me, the hope exists in the local, right? So, but it also is a question of, okay, so one of the things that I found myself thinking about is how manipulable so many relatively vulnerable white Southerners are politically over issues that actually don't serve them well, right? And I think that a lot of it actually has to do with the history of not having much faith in politics at all, right? There's more faith in pastors than politics. And part of that has to do with, in some ways, a sense of abandonment from the political architecture, right? So that it's almost the sort of acceptance of a certain form of vulnerability. And the only thing that pushes back against that vulnerability is, in fact, being over somebody else, right? Being better than somebody else. And for that to be manipulated, even as, your children are sick from toxins and the quality of the air. I mean, I told one of my friends from Mississippi that you don't have to get your car inspected in Alabama, and he was like, "What?" And then there's a kind of recklessness to the care of human beings that is seen as just the way things will be, right? And I don't know how to transform it, but I do know that we, at the very least, it is part of the reason why it's so important to do truth telling as frequently as possible and not to worry so much about being in politics. And I know that there are many people who don't. I mean, I had an interaction just 2 days ago where someone was quite angry with me. He's from Memphis, though not Alabama, but it was a similar kind of argument. But, you know, all I could do, you say, well, you know, it wasn't, Memphis wasn't as bad as people say, and that story of the sanitation workers wasn't entirely true. Being, you know, people really did want to integrate. And I said to him, well, why do so many black people have to die? If they really wanted to integrate, why did so many people have to die for that to happen? Right? And he got red and angry. But, you know, that moment, I knew I wasn't going to convince him that all I could do was answer with some, you know, with the simple truth. So all that's a long way of saying, I don't know. Yeah.
Would you ever move back?
Yeah. You know, I mean, this spring.
I'm sorry, did you do?
Oh, I'm sorry. The question was, would I, thank you. The question was, would I ever live back? And absolutely. Part of what's been so, and I'm going to try to say this in a way that I won't start crying, but being on this tour has been so good because I've been Alabama and New Orleans and Florida and Mississippi, and I went back to Mississippi, and now I'm in Virginia, and it's a complicated question for me. There's a beautiful essay that Jesmyn Ward wrote a few years ago about going home to Mississippi. I read that essay and I booed. You know, I was just like, oh, why am I up here? And if it, you know, it's work and life and kids and, you know, all of the decisions you make when you're divorced and all that kind of stuff. But I feel a sense, I feel more deeply connected to who I am when I'm in the deep South, especially. And I look at how I'm nervous because housing prices are going up in Birmingham. So what am I going to do? If I wait too long, I won't be. So, yeah, I think about it a lot. Thank you. Yes?
Along those same lines, you quote Ralph Ellison a lot, and you put his work fantastic use. And I want to say I'm a big fan of yours, and I use your words and repeat them like my favorite rappers. So,
that's the highest compliment. I'm like a rapper.
But one of Ralph Ellison's, Ellison makes a statement about moving from the south to the north and having his language frustrated. And as I'm listening to you, I'm wondering if going down south unlocks your language and equips you to live in you know, urban areas or just deal with the world outside of the south with more language of your own.
That's a great question. So the question is, you know, like in the way that Ellison describes the frustration of language when going north, if my experience of going down south unlocks language. Absolutely, and it's both going home, but also talking to my family. You know, there's the use of language. I mean, it's, you know, it's not a myth, but the social position of the Southern Raconteur is earned, right? It's a place where language is really valued, cleverness in language, beauty in language, elegance in language, eloquence, and that's part of what makes the stereotype of Southerners as ignorant or not well spoken so pernicious. It's exactly the opposite. And so, yeah, there's a freedom of language because for me, because the sentence is seen as valuable, but not just in written form, but spoken form, right? And it's of course it's the homiletic tradition, but it's also the storytelling tradition. It's the tradition around jokes. Yeah, and I would say more than that, part of what was unlocked for me in this book, and also in Breathe, the last book, was feeling like finally I had gotten to a position as a writer where I could use my voice in a way that wasn't going to be a battle over being edited. My voice being edited out, and that part of my voice being edited out. And that feels like a huge transformation in my experience.
Hi, I think you mentioned this in your book, and I just got back. So you
Yeah, thank you. So there's the questions about the way I talk about the differences between Southern white and Black language. And I talk about, and it's not, I should say it's not absolute, but one of the things I talk about is how much things are similar and then how they diverge, right? So that, I'm trying to remember the exact, I should have, but there's things like, to say the similarities or expressions like, put it up, which in other parts of the country people mean put it away, right? Or the fact that, did can be a whole sentence, right? Is this a similar but that, the difference between the actual, like the sort of the sharpness of words or laughter, where I say more often Southern white people's laughter is in the shoulders, and most Southern Black people tend to laugh from the belly more. I mean, it's kind of like these, so it's about, and really I go through that because I want to demonstrate the intimacy of the overlapping cultures, but there are also distinctions. And it would be possible to make even more distinctions. It just didn't work in the architecture of the book, but between regions, right? Of course, there's this huge variation in language between the regions, and food ways, of course, and all of that. But I wanted, part of the point of having moments like that is that I wanted people to think about listening, readers to think about listening carefully, because language is so important. And that there's a lot more happening that we can hear than we necessarily process, right? And that, so that was sort of the point of it. Thank you. Yes, and then, yes, please.
I have a book called Reading Pipe Shop by McDowell.
Yes.
It's kind of a genealogy and a farewell or something.
Yeah.
I guess you got out. But do you have any thoughts about the labor struggles going on with Amazon?
Thank you. Yes, the question is first about Deborah McDowell's Leaving Pipe Shop, which I reviewed when it came out, and is this beautiful memoir of her coming of age in Bessemer, Alabama, right next to Birmingham, and being, a child of a steel mill worker, right? And the immediate thought I had actually when I read the book was, so in my family, the people who worked in the mills were seen as affluent because they got paid much better than everybody else. And actually, my mother had my grandmother, before she passed, had a boyfriend named Mo, who had worked in the mills, and he had black lungs. You could see his settlement, so he had a lot of cash. So he'd have these thick wads of cash in his pocket all the time. And so it was just this interesting, and so this question, so the second part of the question is about labor, right? And it is, I'm glad that there's labor organizing happening in the South again, especially because it has been so dramatically crushed generation after generation, especially in Alabama. There's this extraordinary history of labor organizing in the state. And we're also seeing again the strategies for to squashing it. So in Memphis, for example, and I wrote about this during Black History in a newsletter during Black History Month. Starbucks, was championing King and Black history, and at the same time, the Starbucks workers who were organizing, who were trying to unionize, were all fired in Memphis. And I wrote about that sort of this extraordinary, where King was murdered, supporting labor organizing, and there's this sort of champion, and that part of what we have to do, I think, and this is why I so appreciate this question, and I try to do this in the book, is unearth this part of Southern history that people don't talk about in public. There's incredible scholarship on it, right? Really, but that organizing around labor is a central part of the tradition and critical to the labor movement in the United States, which we tend to think of largely in terms of the Midwest and the Northeast. So, yes, I'm glad it's happening. I think it's also important that we draw attention to it and we talk about it as frequently as possible. Yes, I'm sorry, yes.
I lived around DC, but my family pretty much came from Arkansas and Texas. And I go and visit my relatives every once in a while. And they're very interested in showing me how non-racist they are. They seem to be able to handle conversations on the topic of personal racism. But they do seem to have a great deal of resentment when institutional racism comes up.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you had any insight into why that would be true.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think, oh yes, I'll repeat the question. So this gentleman is talking about his family in Arkansas and Texas.
Certainly recently with CRT coming up, and
Gosh.
people actually misunderstanding what CRT is to start
Right.
with. But,
Thank you. So the question is about relatives who can talk about interpersonal racism, but cannot think about or address institutional racism or acknowledge it, right? And to be honest, I think that's a national issue, frankly. One of these things that I'm always saying when people talk about red states and blue states, that all the states are purple, that it's just a tiny bit, so much, there's just a little bit of difference that makes the difference, and so, that's relevant to the question. And I think part of it is that it is hard for people to hold on to, I think especially for white Americans, but I think it's hard for people in general to hold on to the fact that they may be vulnerable and that they have to compete in a difficult landscape, and also that their advantage means the others, like to hold all of that at the same time. And because we live in such a hyper-competitive society, the idea that any advantage that one has may be taken away makes people panic, right? I mean, one of the best examples is, in fact, leftist professors when college admissions time comes around for their kids, right? We talk all about it. The people have a heart. People can say in the abstract, sometimes they think things should just be fair, but people also want to take advantage of every advantage they have. And whiteness has functioned that way, and for many people, that's the only thing they have, right? And so the question, one of the things I say in the book, I talk about encountering, there's in Nashville, a man who was changing the vending machine, right? And I'm like, he's a white man, and I'm like, here he is, his uniform is too big, his job is changing the vending machine, and here I am, an Ivy League professor. And so, the promise of whiteness didn't turn out when you compare us next to each other, right? Both born in the South, and of the same generation, right? But my point, and where I follow with that, and we have a lovely interaction, where I follow with that is that he does have a cause to be angry. It's just I'm not the one to be angry with, right? I mean, because people are, it's not a fair society for white people either. It's just more unfair for Black people, right? And so I think and because we're taught that things are a zero-sum game, right? That's why it becomes hard to sort of imagine, well, what if the we, because the we is actually, the we can be at the vast majority of Americans when you think about how deep the inequality is between the top 1% and everybody else, right? Everybody in this nation should be able to live relatively comfortably. Everybody should be able to have a job. It could work, right? But there's not a commitment to organizing the society in that way, and so instead people find themselves hoarding and competing against those who might be allies otherwise.
So you think that the answer is basically competition?
I think it's competition, and it's also socialization and the story and manipulation. Right, when we think about the story, remember the story of George Wallace in Alabama when, like, he learned, if you don't start talking about segregation, you're not gonna win anything, right? Like, sort of ramping up this sort of fever pitch of resentment. We say, I mean, the politics of resentment are always being activated now. I mean, I just think that, like, in a case, and it's hard for me to talk about because I find it so devastating, but the way in which, like, trans kids are being depicted as a threat. Kids. Right? Like, you know, and it's I mean, it's just who are a tiny portion of the population who are so vulnerable. And I think, you know, it's the way, you know, the sort of these manipulations that happen, and meanwhile, in fact, every moment when there's legislation around issues like this, what's underneath it is legislation that's about facilitated corporations. It's always part of, like, that, it's always tacked on, but that's not the part that activates the resentment, right? And so part of it is competition, part of it is manipulation, part of it is socialization, and part of it is that we actually have to kind of reinvigorate what it means to have political representation in a deep way. Yes.
Thank you for coming to Virginia. One of the excerpts you read in your speech, the physical landscape was very present. It was the honeysuckle and the swamp, and that was part of the identity or connection of the place. I wonder if you could talk to that about your, you know, this idea of the South, multiple things.
Yeah, I mean, the landscape is, the question is about, I read the section from Arna Baton talking about the landscape in Tuskegee, not Tuskegee, in Huntsville, where my grandparents are from, and how, and it is a quote that is, in which, you know, the landscape is so present and part of the connection, and you know, that's, I think that it is a really profound part of identity, regional identity, right? And so, so for me, there's another part in that essay about pecans, which is for me the experience, you know, like so much of my association with home is about going out in the back and picking them up, right? And having the skill to craft them without a nutcracker. You put two together and you have enough strength in your hand to craft a book. It's a sensory part of identity, right? And experience. And the landscape is just so beautiful all throughout, right? And I did an event with Edwidge Danticott a few days ago, and she was talking about the part where I talk about what it means to see orchids in the wild in Florida. And you know, for her that was resonant. And I was like, yeah, I mean, you know, it's sort of remarkable, and I think that it is the tension between the incredible beauty and the violence that was done to the land and to people in relation to the land is ever present, right? And in some ways, part of the journey is to figure out how to get in right relation to the land and each other in time, sometimes, and it sort of feels like we're running out of time for that. Yes?
And to that point about getting in touch with each other, the land and each other, do you see causes for hopefulness that we might be able to come together and more people in more real ways and effect some closure of those huge gaps that have opened up between us all?
So you're asking, do I find some sources of hope to addressing the huge gaps and inequality and suffering between groups of people? I'm hopeful in the local sense. You know, when I see organizations doing meaningful work, you know, I don't know that there's much in the history. The last 10 years have been very difficult. I remember, so the night that Trump was elected president, my younger son started crying early in the evening. And everybody was saying to him, "Oh, don't cry. This is just the early return." And he was like, "No." he was little. And my response when I started crying, but I was like, my mother grew up in Birmingham when it was Birmingham. She already lived in a white nationalist state. She spent so much of her life fighting against it, and now we're back here again. Are you serious? Right? And so so hope is tricky, but in a larger sense, but I think that there are people to place hope in. And I do think that Generation Z, for all of the criticism that they get, I am in such awe of young people because they are unwilling, so many of them, they're unwilling to make any accommodations. Like, their sense of justice is absolute. Like, you need to be fair on every count, right? And they have such sophistication around what it means to be oneself, right? And to construct community. So I do have hope, but I also feel like there's no resolution is happening in any of our lifetimes. Yes.
So the other night, I was at another book event with Ann Applebaum, who runs the...
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
So the other night, I was at another book event with Ann Applebaum, who writes about Eastern Europe, the Holocaust, and right now she's covering the Ukraine war. And in hearing what you're discussing today, you're talking about World War I, World War II, current events in Europe. What's striking is that you're describing the same sorts of forces. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that she and the others in her camp that look at the Holocaust describe, and they talk about these modern implications, that at the end of the day, a lot of those people, they don't believe in democracy at all. They believe in dehumanization. They believe in large dehumanization of others. And so, as you know, it's the same forces here, and she felt the same way.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, I think the comment was about speaking. I can't remember the author's name. You say it again? Ann Applebaum, who does work on world wars and the Holocaust and talking about how what's happening in Ukraine today, that these same sort of forces, anti-democratic forces and oppressive forces, continue to be sort of reinvigorated, and that there's a thread of similarity. And the thing it makes me think of is actually, to go back to Huntsville again, is that after World War II, and there were many Black soldiers from Huntsville who went to fight in World War II, including members of my family, the United States government, through the creation of NASA, invited Nazi scientists to work on the space race. And there are a lot of apologetics, but there are survivors of the Holocaust who say, no, especially the leader, Von Braun, right, worked adjacent to gas chambers. And I mention that because I think there are people who are undemocratic, but there's also the problem of, in that instance, right, so you have people in your town who fought against fascism, right, who are still Jim Crow. You bring a fascist in a position of authority and domination because the desire to win a space race is so much more important than anything else. And to me, that imperial power, that ambition, is in some ways so insidious because it can undo all pretenses towards democracy, right? So, this idea, well, the point is, okay, so we'll just win this and then we'll deal with this internal stuff later. Gotta be considered, yeah. So I appreciate that point because I think one of the things that we in our political binary, we forget that element, which can turn everything upside down. You know, the desire to be all powerful.
Since I don't want to be too negative here, since people are asking about hopeful, what the South Palm said was that it's up to us to be just as vigilant and as relentless in seeking equity and justice as people who don't like justice are relentless. So we have to be vigilant, we have to stay on top of it, because they don't.
Right. We have to be, I think that's right. So the point that, you know, saying that it's up to us, for those who, you know, believe in democracy and justice, to be as vigilant as those who aren't. I also think that we have to think about the substance of that vigilance, because, you know, one can both go outside and protest and actually do the kind of work that is that disables democratic possibility, right? Like, so we have to think at the level, not just the position we take, but the roles we serve. And I certainly, and I say that because this is one of the questions that I find myself confronting, right? What does it mean to be deeply invested and work for an institution that in many ways supports the status quo, right? Like, how do I offset that in my life? Should we have time for one more question?
I think one more question, last question.
Okay, the question is this. We are deeply invested in trying to reconcile the way we have treated African Americans. But we're not putting no discussion about our episode of ethnic cleansing, known as failed here. Why is that?
Okay, so the question is, why does it, the question is, why are we more invested in addressing the way African Americans have been treated than Indigenous people have been treated? One, I'm not entirely sure about all that investment. I think there's a lot of superficial behavior, right? But I also think, and it requires a lot of kind of exegesis. But part of this has to do with the sovereignty of Indigenous nations and the mechanisms for addressing. So we have the way, because it is a colonial enterprise, the U.S. vis-a-vis Indigenous people, that, you know, when you do, like, I'll give an example. When I teach race in the American law, it has taken me years to figure out how to introduce the histories of Indigenous people into that course, because it's an entirely separate body of law. And because the U.S. is a colonial enterprise vis-a-vis those nations, the breaching of treaties has a very different sort of sensibility than interpreting of anti-discrimination law. In both instances, the people of color lose. But in the case of those who are citizens of the United States and, you know, historically oppressed, it can look like what we're just doing is supporting equal protection under the law, right? Even though now equal protection claims tend to favor anti-discrimination law on the one hand, on the other hand, we have a question of what is basically a sort of, what is a law that's supposed to respect sovereignty but doesn't, but we don't have an anti-colonial language that has much currency in this country. So the conversation doesn't go anywhere because we actually, none of us, but we generally don't have a language to even talk about it. That's one piece. The other piece is people act as though, and this is very true, and this is a really big problem, that Indigenous people are dead. And so there are not 5 million Indigenous people in this country, right? And so as a consequence, there are these sort of romantic narratives of the past, as opposed to thinking about, so we could learn actually, I think, a lot about, even though Canada doesn't treat First Nations people particularly well, but the conversation about race there is much more robust vis-a-vis First Nations people than it is here. So to support your point, but also I think there's structural reasons why part of the conversation is hampered. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
reminders. Books are for sale in the back of the room from New Dominion, and Dr. Perry will sign books. We would love to know what you think about our programming, and there is a QR code or a link on the back of every printed guide. And if you would like to hear more about South to America, please join us Saturday night at the Paramount at 7 p.m. when Dr. Perry will be joined by Ralph Eubanks, Jocelyn Nicole Johnson, and Justin Reed in a program called Southern Landscapes, Real and Imagined. Thank you all so much.